But before I do that, I want to make a short announcement. Today's webinar marks the 12th in our series, a full year of presentations since we started. It'll be the last webinar that I will host, but the series will continue in the virtual format under the leadership of Dr. Praveen Khadka, who will chair the organizing committee, which includes Ms. Binisha Nepal and Mr. Sudyumna Dal. One of the few silver linings of this crazy pandemic disruption is that we've learned how to do things virtually, and a series like this that brings together researchers from across the world, so many different time zones, would not be possible in any other kind of format. So that's why we've decided to continue in the virtual format. So now to today's event. Our speaker today is Dr. Juni Singh. Dr. Singh is a Weiss Fellow postdoc at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, and starting next year will be a postdoc in the Humanities and Social Sciences Division at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. Juni is an experimental economist with expertise in the fields of social and economic networks, development economics, behavioral economics, and economic theory more broadly. She has also done work on a range of topics relevant to Nepal, from the effects of Gorkha recruitment on Nepali society to the adoption of environmental technologies in rural settings and more. She earned her PhD in economics from the Paris School of Economics and is also a graduate of St. Stephen's College in Delhi. The moderator today will be Dr. Gaurab Aryal. Dr. Aryal is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Virginia. And before that, he was an assistant professor at the Australian National University and a postdoc in the economics department at the University of Chicago. Gaurab's research is mainly in the fields of industrial organization, but he has also published papers in the fields of structural econometrics and economic theory. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in some of the top journals in economics, including the American Economic Review and the Review of Economic Studies. Gaurab earned his PhD in economics at Penn State University and is also a graduate of the Indian Statistical Institute and Sri Ram College in Delhi. Okay, so now before Dr. Singh starts, let me remind our participants of the ground rules. Please remember to keep your mics muted unless you're invited to speak. Juni will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. Then we'll have a few minutes of commentary from Gaurab, followed by a Q&A session. You're welcome to send in your questions via chat or use the raise hand feature on Zoom. Okay, Juni, you may start.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, Navi. I'm very pleased to be presenting on the 1-year anniversary of our virtual talk. So Melissa, I'm going to be presenting a paper that is titled Endogenous Institution, a Network Experiment in Nepal, which is co-authored with Giulio Iacobelli from Paris School of Economics. And I'm very excited to be presenting this paper, particularly because we are going to be using a set of novel methods, right from social network data collection, followed by a lab in the field experiment sort of the setting in order to understand behaviors of women in these Nepali villages. So let me directly move on to the motivation and then continue on with the matter of the presentation. So in terms of the motivation, in the absence of strong formal institutions, it's very often the case that local communities are responsible for community-based projects. So just to give you a few examples, in the Nepali case, we are very well aware about the forest user groups, about the poverty funds, and so on and so forth. And so these institutions particularly work so well because these are based with closed-knit communities. One mechanism to reinforce cooperation in such a setting is peer monitoring. So what I mean by peer monitoring is simply when somebody from the village is responsible to monitor actions of other people in the village. And the reason peer monitoring works so well in these small community settings particularly is there might be some sort of a punishment feature within these programs, which is a material punishment kind of an idea where you pay a fine if you don't behave in a certain manner. But what is more interesting for us is this reputation concern where you behave in a certain manner because you are part of this village, and because you have social ties and you need to maintain certain reputation in the village. This has been studied by Ostrom in our seminal papers, and our paper is very much going to rely on this feature of being based on social ties. So in particular, we're going to be understanding or trying to give you a picture of demand for such a monitoring institution, peer monitoring, and then understand how reputation can be a plausible channel in order to improve cooperation in such a setting. Let me quickly mention, if you have any clarifying questions, please feel free to interrupt at any point. So what do I mean by networks? Why is reputation important in these settings? So a network is simply the build-up of the village. So who is connected to who is friends with whom, and so on and so forth. And this is particularly important in these small communities because people rely on local connections, on personalized relationship, right from risk sharing to public provision to information delivery. And there are a couple of papers that look at how the behavior of the individual can very much depend on the network position, implying depending on who I am interacting with, I behave in a certain manner. So if I am interacting with close friends, I have greater trust, I cooperate better. Whereas if I'm interacting with people that I don't know very well, I behave in a different way. And then there are also papers on trust-based networks, which are useful for informal contract enforcement and so on. And this one particular paper by Chandrasekhar and Reza, they show that people cooperate better in the presence of a central monitor. What I mean by central monitor is basically somebody who is important to the village. So if you take two people who don't know each other very well, who are in the same village, maybe they see each other every now and then, but they do not know each other very well. Having a person who is important to the network or who is well connected in the village helps improve cooperation between these two individuals. So through our paper, we're basically taking a step forward and asking, what happens if the individuals have the choice to choose their monitor? So we know what happens when you are randomly assigned a monitor, but what if I give you the choice of choosing a monitor? Do you then choose one or not? Secondly, following up from that, is there a difference in behavior with an elected monitor versus a one that is randomly assigned by a third party? And last but not the least, to really understand how individual behavior varies across different group composition, in particular, closely knit groups where everybody knows each other, and sparse groups where we are acquaintances, but we don't know each other that well. So let me just give you a flavor of what our experimental design is. What is it that we're trying to get at with this paper? So we use a very unique setting of a real social network. So using real villages, real network. We try to understand how monitoring mechanisms based on reputation can be effective in these settings. So we start off with a network survey, and this survey is going to be used for two purposes. So firstly, to understand the structure of the village. So who is connected to who is friends with whom. And secondly, to understand who is important in the village. So in the sense, who is well connected in the village. So the network survey is going to be used for these two purposes. So what do I mean by network survey? I'm going to explain in greater details what that consists of, but just to give you an idea, it's a set of questions where I ask, who are your friends? Who do you interact with most? Who do you trust? And so on and so forth. And then following this network survey, we're going to have a lab in the field experiment, which is basically a group of 3 women are going to play a set of games where we try to understand their behavior in this particular setting. So in this case, we're going to look at a contribution game where individuals can vote for having a monitor or not having a monitor. So contribution game, again, I'm going to mention this in greater details, but just to give you an idea, is basically where 3 people decide how much to contribute for a public good sort of a setting versus how much they want to keep for themselves. And so following up from this brief introduction, our paper mainly contributes to the literature on endogenous institution and monitoring in the spirit of Dalbo. In particular, we look at the positive effect of having chosen your own monitor, so what we term as endogenous choice, and how this is heterogeneous across different group compositions. Secondly, we have this rich, very, very rich literature on social networks, on using real networks to understand everyday behavior. So we are going to be studying demand for monitors in this situation. And lastly, and more importantly, we're going to be looking at the mechanism which is sort of leading this sort of a behavior, which is social image, concern, and other regarding preferences. So I behave in a certain manner with a group of friends versus with people I do not know, according to how I want my social image, in other words, reputation to be. And we investigate if this could be an effective tool in order to improve cooperation within these villages. Just to give you a brief preview of the results, we established that people who are far away in the network, so what we term as sparse groups, they are more likely to elect a monitor than dense groups. Allowing people to choose their own monitoring institutions improves cooperation, but it's very heterogeneous across different group compositions. And revealing the choice of the monitor, so to tell you exactly who the group has chosen as a monitor, carries some extra information, what we call signaling value, that leads to spillovers in terms of behaviors. So before I move on to the overview, do we have any questions at this point?
Do you want to take the question right now, or do you want to do everything at the end? Whatever you want.
I think
there's one question.
With each section, I think it's a good idea.
So yeah, there's one question by number, I don't know. Why is not social capital considered for social relations in community in a village?
So when you say social capital, you mean relations between people, correct?
I would imagine.
I'm assuming so. So we do consider. So we were sort of considering this social relations, social ties, in, if you want to term as capital, as a form of establishing cooperation in the village. So I think it's one and the same thing to say social capital versus social ties. Okay, so I think this section particularly is going to be important in understanding what exactly we did in the village. So I'm going to start with the context, move towards the experiment, and then follow it up with the results. So in terms of the context, we were in rural Makwanpur, covering around 19 middle villages. These were very small villages comparatively, with 70 households per village. So it was Barjabarai, Chitlang, and Palu. And then we sampled around 1,500 women between ages 18 to 60 years. And we focused on women particularly because of high migration rates of men within these villages. And in the network survey, so like I mentioned before, we had a list of questions which we asked to each woman in every household. So we covered the entire village. And the questions were in the line of, who do you speak to when you have a problem? Who do you take advice from? Who do you borrow money from? So really multi-dimensional relations. And a link was formed, the two women were connected if any of them named the other one as a possible friend. So just to give you an example, so these circles are women in the villages. This is the network structure of the village. So this person is basically connecting these two different components in the village. And a link established if any one of them says that we are friends. So for instance, if I say that Gaurab is my friend, then we have a connection in this setting. So it's an undirected network. So following up with this network survey, we then had an idea of the composition of the village. And then we could assign for each village, so each of the 19 villages, 2 monitors as possible monitoring candidates. So we basically used a term which we call eigenvector centrality, is basically somebody who has a lot of influence in the village because I have many friends and my friends have many friends. So that is sort of an idea of centrality. So we picked somebody who's very central in the village, this person circled in red, for instance, and somebody who's slightly not so central in the village or least central in the village, who's circled in blue here. And we really wanted to contrast these two cases because we wanted to study who is going to be chosen as the monitor. Is it somebody who you know very well, or is it somebody who is important in the village? To give you an overview of the experiment, I'm going to explain each component in greater detail. So we start off by assigning the women to one of the groups. So either you are in groups with your close friends or with people you do not know very well, and you randomize these group compositions. This is followed by voting. So I know exactly who I'm playing with. These were in classrooms, particularly in school. So there are 3 women, they know who they are interacting with. And then we ask them, okay, given that you are playing with these women today, do you feel the need to then vote for a monitor? And if you vote for a monitor, then of course you need to pay a certain amount. And the options were either you vote for no monitor, a high central monitor, or low central monitor. So this person is a third party, sort of an external person to the group, who is then going to be invited to observe the game only if chosen. And so once the voting is done, we randomize the order in which groups play endogenous and exogenous treatment. What I mean by endogenous is somebody who's chosen by the group. So once you play with a person who's chosen by the group, and once you play with a person who we randomly assign to you. So there are 2 rounds of contribution game, one with a monitor of your choice and one with a monitor that we assign you. And so the identity of the monitor that was chosen by the group is revealed only right in the beginning of the endogenous case. And then the circle is again repeated with a different group composition. So every woman plays 4 times, twice in a sparse group, twice in a dense group. Okay, so I'm assuming that this is clear, and moving on to explaining each parts of the experiment. So let's start from randomizing the groups. So like I gave the example previously of the network map. So this is a part of the network map. The person circled in green is going to once be playing with people circled in red, which is going to be a closed group, because we said that all 3 of us are friends, we're close friends. And then once you are interacting with people who are far away in the network, who is marked with blue in this case. So in our definition, close was anybody who is distance 2, and sparse was anybody who's distance 4. So what I mean by distance 4 is in order to get to you, I need to go, I need to pass via 4 people to sort of get to you. So that was the idea of these 2 different compositions. And then once you have this group composition fixed for each woman, you are then given choice to either vote for no monitor, a low central monitor, and a high central monitor. So this high and low central monitor is unique to each village. And so if you vote for a monitor, there's certain monetary cost that is paid at the level of the individual, not the level of the group. And so the role of the monitor is central and really key to our experiment. So like I mentioned before, we are relying solely on reputation concern. There is no material punishment, there's no fine in this game. So if I decide to vote for a monitor, I paid certain amount. And if the monitor is chosen by the group, they get to observe the contribution of each of the women. So 3 women in a group, everybody is given 10 tokens of different colors. So the monitor simply enters the room, observes the contribution of each woman in the pot, which would otherwise be private information. So there's no action per se. It's a purely reputation concern that is driving behavior in this game. Then you randomize the order of which monitor you play with first. So either you play with, depending on who the group has chosen, the choice of the group, or a randomly assigned monitor. And then there is no overriding of monitor choice, in the sense you play both with a monitor that was chosen by the group and a monitor that we randomly assigned. And we really want to see what is the difference in behavior in these 2 groups, where we randomize the order of the monitoring institutions. So the contribution game that I've been mentioning for quite a while is basically a simple, what we call in economics, a public good game, where each player, so each woman in the village is, in the group is given 10 tokens of different colors, and we tell them, your task today is simple, you just need to decide how many tokens you want to keep for yourself and how many tokens you want to contribute to the public pot. And anything that you contribute to the public pot is going to increase in value by 50% and distributed equally, irrespective of your initial contribution. So this idea of free riding on others' contribution. And so at the end of the game, of course, you receive cash corresponding to one of the 4 rounds that you played. So just to give you an idea before I move on to the results, who these women were, they were women on average with 30 years old, 3 years of education. And so on average, a person was found to have around 10 connections. And in terms of caste story, because these villages were very homogeneous in terms of castes, there were around 70% of the women from same caste across different group compositions. So it was not the case that in a closed group you were of the same caste and in the sparse group you were of different castes. It was pretty much similar in terms of balance. About the monitor, so we've separated a high central and a low central monitor for each village. So somebody who's highly central is somebody who's important in the village. And in terms of characteristics, they're very similar people. So they have same caste, almost same level of education. So the only difference between these two different types of monitors is their power to influence the village, is their position in the network in terms of how many people they're connected to. So before I move on to the mechanism, do we have any questions on
there's one question from Abhijit. Someone just read it out. It has two parts. So first is, do you see any evidence that play changes from round 1 to round 2 because of learning? That's the first question. The second question is, if so, then wouldn't we expect a learning effect between round 2 with the close players and round 1 with the distant player? So differential learning across two groups.
So because we randomized, so this was also one of our concerns. So that's why we were very particular in terms of what feedback we gave to the women. So there was no feedback between rounds, absolutely no feedback. So they were just contributing to the common pot, once in a closed group setting, once in a group where they do not know each other very well. So we minimized learning as much as possible. It was just the familiarity with the game, but in terms of learning about free riding and how the game works, I think it was very limited because we had no feedback between rounds. And so I think that also sort of touches upon the second part of the question. So if there was a learning effect between when you play in a dense group versus when you played in a sparse group. So in the case where there was some sort of a feedback where you said, okay, this is how much the group contributed, this is how much you got. I think there would be some concerns of learning driving difference in behavior, but we sort of closed that channel by not giving any feedback between rounds in order to minimize the learning. Okay, so let me move on to the mechanism briefly, and then move on to the results and conclusion. So in order to explain our findings, we have sort of built a model in order to understand how individuals behave in such settings. So we use altruism as our main factor to explain difference in dense groups and sparse groups. So if I am in a dense group, if I am with my friends, I am more likely to be altruistic. Altruistic simply means more likely to help them, more likely to be cooperative towards them. And whereas if I'm in a sparse group, I'm less likely to be altruistic simply because I don't know these group of people. So the idea is that the utility from choosing a monitor is going to depend on my utility plus how much I care about the other person in the group. And how much I care about the other person in the group is a function of my altruism, which I represent by alpha I, but also as a function of what I think about the other person, so which is the belief about the other person, which is mu0 I alpha j. And so the idea really is I'm not aware of what type of person the other one is, but revealing the choice of the monitor sort of gives me additional information about what kind of group I am in. So if I am in closed group and I see people vote for a monitor, I sort of sense that there is lack of trust and hence I behave in a certain manner. So a high central monitor signaling low trust, whereas a low central monitor is signaling presence of trust in the group. And I accordingly update mu0 I, which is my belief about what the other person's type is. So simply just to give you an idea of why we build this model and why not any other model in this case. So we asked, we went back to these villages and asked women, why would you vote for a monitor? And around 80% of the women agreed that it was because of threat of reputation, because this person was able to influence their image in the village. And then we also asked what percent would be informed if information was given to somebody who is well connected, somebody who is averagely connected, and somebody who is not connected at all. So as you see that somebody who is well connected is more probable of spreading information, hence influencing your reputation more compared to somebody who's not very well connected. And so we also have some, if a monitor is chosen, the reputation impact is captured by this term minus delta PCI, which is basically if I contribute lesser than a certain threshold, going back to the slide, if I contribute less than a certain threshold, I will be punished because people will sort of have this image of me that I don't contribute as much in a game setting. So following up from the brief preview of the model, do we have any questions on why we use altruism, what sort of functions are, what mechanism we have in mind? Otherwise, I can move on to the results.
Yeah, there's just one question right now. Would the altruism parameter also capture free riding?
So we haven't thought of the altruism parameter per se capturing free riding, because if I go back to the slide, oops. So if I go back to the slide, we have two altruism types. So alpha H being I sort of want to help and cooperate, alpha L being low altruism type. So you could, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here. So you could sort of think as your type as representing, so to equate altruism to free riding, where maybe you're less likely to free ride when you're in closed groups, hence contribute more, and more likely to free ride in the sparse groups, hence contribute less. So that could be a possible reasoning to sort of link altruism to free riding. Okay, so let me move on to the results then. And then fairly quickly move on to the conclusion, followed by the questions. Okay, so the first result that we have is with respect to voting. So who do people choose as monitors? Our hypothesis was if I am in a group where I don't know people very well, I am more likely to vote for a monitor who's well connected, what we call a high central monitor. And this is exactly what we observe in this diagram. So blue stands for sparse groups, whereas orange stands for dense groups, closely knit groups. So sparse groups are significantly more likely to vote for a high central monitor compared to dense groups. And there's a small demand for low central monitor, but not so much as compared to somebody who's well connected in the village. So we also sort of reiterate this fact by doing a multi-logit regression where we have a choice between a high central monitor, low monitor, and no monitor. And then we see that being in a sparse groups, you are 40% more likely to choose a high central monitor compared to being in a dense group. And then you, of course, can look at a variation at the level of individual, variation at the level of group voting. And so there are different patterns that you can observe. So for instance, just to give you an example, there are some people who don't vary their strategy across different group compositions. So they maintain sort of a constant, always voting for no monitor, always voting for high central monitor. And then there is variation if you look at between dense group and sparse groups. So there are some people who vote for no monitor when with their friends, and low monitor in some cases, and so on and so forth. So there's really variation in individual voting strategy across groups. And so let me move on to the next set of results, which is about the contribution. So this is sort of reiterating what we find in Breza and Chandrasekhar, that is exogenously randomly assigning a third-party monitor who's a high central, so H stands for somebody with influence, increases the contribution more so in a sparse group. So we see an increase of 15.8% of the mean, whereas in dense group, the contribution is not very significantly high. So there's not much difference in terms of contribution when an exogenous monitor is chosen. And what is more interesting for us is to see the difference in contribution patterns when the monitor is chosen by the group versus when we externally impose a third-party monitor. So to show that to you graphically, we take a subset of the total sample. So we are comparing groups where they interact with the same kind of monitor in both endogenous and exogenous group to get rid of the selection effect. And so if you look at, in this case, this is blue is when exogenous monitor is played, and red is when endogenous monitor is played. So this is when a no monitor is chosen in sparse groups. So even in sparse groups, so you see that there is a significant increase in contribution when the monitor is chosen by the group itself. And then to show you what happens in dense groups, whereas in dense group, there seems to be not much happening in terms of monitor choice impacting contribution decision. So here you see in the sparse groups where people do not know each other very well, 20% increase in contribution from the mean. And to sort of present a parallel story. So this is what happens when no monitor is chosen by the group. So what happens when a high central monitor is chosen by the group? So if you look at the contributions between the blue one, which is in the exogenous case, randomly assigned high central monitor versus a high central monitor that is chosen by the group, you see again that there is an significant increase in sparse group, whereas in dense group, there's a slight change, but not as significant as the one in sparse group. And so we really wanted to understand what is driving this behavior. So why are people contributing more in endogenous case compared to the exogenous case? And what is sort of driving this behavior and this difference between sparse and dense group? So one explanation that Dalbo present is it is because you sort of empower people to choose their own monitoring institution. So we sort of complement that reasoning with a second reasoning, which is when you choose your own monitoring institution, you reveal something about your preference about the group to the group members. So to give you an example from our experiment, so this is the design that I presented earlier. So voting followed by random order followed by the contribution game. So having revealed the identity of the monitor chosen by the group is really central here, because then I sort of understand who I am dealing with. So if I'm in a group which I thought were my friends, and I trust them, and I hence decided not to vote for a monitor, and I see that they indeed voted for a monitor, I sort of feel a little. I feel that these people don't trust me, and hence I behave in a certain manner. So this fact that in endogenous cases you reveal who the group has chosen as a monitor carries extra information, which then acts as a change in behavior. So to show you an example, so now I'm going to be clubbing cases where you play endogenous first, followed by exogenous, and exogenous followed by endogenous. So the blue one is when exogenous is played first. The red one is when endogenous is played first. Endogenous being, I have chosen my monitor myself. Okay. So in this case, you see that playing endogenous first, like I just mentioned before, carries extra information about the type in the group. So in sparse groups, you see that having seen that groups vote for no monitor, there is a significant increase in contribution across both endogenous and exogenous rounds. Similarly, if you look at dense groups, now we see that some action is happening in the dense group. Having chosen no monitor increases contribution in both endogenous and exogenous rounds if endogenous is played first. So if I play with my friends, if I see that they voted for no monitor, I improve my cooperation, I increase contribution in both endogenous and exogenous rounds if you look at the average. Now again, to paint a parallel picture, what happens with the high central monitor, we see that with a high central monitor, there is an increase in contribution for the sparse groups, when I know slightly so, not significantly. So when I see that a person has voted for a high central monitor, I increase my contribution slightly. But what is more interesting is what we see in dense groups. So to bring you back to the original story, where if I see my friends have voted for a high central monitor, when I myself voted for a no monitor, I decrease my contribution level, as you can see in this graph. So we go down from the blue to the red when endogenous is played first. So this is the signaling, the spillover idea that I was mentioning before. So this is about it for our central results. So before I conclude, we're taught on time, so around 35 minutes. So let me take a question here and then move on to the conclusion.
Okay, we have a question from Abhijit. It's a two-part question, so let me first go the first one. Did you give the players a slate of possible candidates for monitor, or did they have to nominate their own monitor?
So we had, yeah, so basically we had, we gave them a sheet of paper with the slate of options. So we gave them no monitor, name of somebody who is highly central in the village. So for example, in this group, let's say Avidit would be somebody who's central, who everybody knows in the group, and I would be somebody who's not very central. So in the name, if a high central, you would have to vote between Avi and me, basically. So they were given fixed options because we wanted to contrast this high central and low central idea. And I see there's a follow-up for them question, wouldn't it be mechanical that they choose a central monitor since they can't nominate someone they don't know? So this was the idea that we sort of wanted to explore, because we were sampling groups that are close to the central monitor, so close to somebody who's well connected, but we also sampled from groups that are far apart, who don't know the central monitor so well. So the monitor is well connected, but I personally sort of don't know the central monitor, and I probably might know somebody who is low central better because they're closer to me, because we're friends, we are sort of in the periphery of the village, not well connected. But even in these cases, we see that they vote for the central monitor. So the story is not that because I know person X, I vote for person X, but it's because I know sort of both person X and Y, but I know that person X, who's a high central monitor, can effectively transmit information, can have a greater reputation effect, or have a greater impact on reputation than person Y, and hence I vote for this person. So that's sort of the story that we're proposing. Okay, so let me move on to the conclusion then, followed by the questions. So when given the choice to elect a monitor, sparse groups or groups that are far away from each other in the network, they prefer to be monitored compared to groups that are closely knit or groups that know each other very well. And who do they choose as a monitor? It's somebody who is well connected in the village. So rather than voting for their friends, who's somebody low central, for example, they choose to vote for a monitor that is well known in the village. And so this improves cooperation in the setting where people do not know each other very well. And disclosing the choice of the group, they can send additional signal about the expected level of cooperation. So like I showed you before, with the high central monitor versus with the low central monitor, there's a difference in their level of cooperation depending on who was chosen as the monitor by the group. And so just to give you an idea of what is coming up next and a flavor for how we can apply this work. So we're in touch with the mayor of Thar Nagarpalika, that's in Makwanpur, the villages that we covered. And so the idea is to basically have a policy implication saying in community-based organization setting, rather than randomly assigning a third-party monitor, let individuals or let people choose their own monitoring system. And we have several follow-ups in pipeline, one of them being adoption of environment-friendly technologies, and also on empowering women on pursuing fields other than agriculture. And so we just got back from extending our sample from 19 to 30 villages in order to sort of facilitate our follow-up. So let me just move on with the last slide. So this was our group 3 years back with this group of enumerators and women in 19. So this is one of the 19 villages. And so I'm happy to receive question, comments. And so if there's no time at the end of the presentation, please feel free to mail me at this address. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juni. That was brilliant. We could probably take questions, but I don't see any. If you have questions, you could either raise hand or put it in the chat. But let me just say a few words, Juni, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you close the? Let me share.
Stop share.
I need permission, I guess. No, I can. Okay, can you see?
Yeah.
Let me do the full screen. I can't really speak without, yeah, finish. Let me finish and then I'll come back to your question. So just to give you a wrap up of this paper, just let me go through this a little bit, and Juni, you can, so it's first of all, it's not my research area, so I might bungle things up, but hopefully not, but let's see. So this is a paper on Endogenous Institution, an experiment in Nepal by Julio and Juni. So let me walk through a little bit. I read this paper called Unbundling Institution a few years ago by Daron Azemoglu and Simon Johnson, where they basically insist on kind of disentangling institution into 2 parts. Okay, so the first part, what they call, is the property right institution. So it's a social, economic, legal, and political organization of a society that protects citizens from expropriation by the government and elites. So basically, if I have money, if I have a house, it protects me from somebody from expropriating my house. That's one kind of institution they talk about. The second institution they talk about is contracting institution, which is basically it's institution that allows private individuals to contract with each other. Okay, and this is all based on Douglas North's, who was a Nobel laureate, work. And what they find, which I thought was kind of interesting, was that when they looked at European colonies, and they find that property right institution has a first order effect on long run economic growth. And I think so they find that property right institution tends to be the most important driver of growth, investment, whereas they find that the contracting institution, the institution among two private individuals, affects only the form of intermediation. So this is kind of puzzling because, if you think about contract theory, most of the focus is on the contracting institution. So it was a bit, but I think what this means is that contracting institutions are important, but unlike property right institution, contracting institutions are really adaptable at the local level, right? So if they adapt to the local level, if there is some kind of difficulties in the system, they adapt to whatever the system is, and they perform really well. I think that was the insight that I kind of like, and I'm going to come back to it later. And so let me get to the contracting institution, just to give you an idea. So contracting institution is basically regulates transaction between private parties. Think about someone who is borrowed and a bank who's lent, right? So of course the debtor would like not to pay the loan, but the creditor would like to increase the interest rate, right? So and the contracting institution ensures that debtor pays, creditor gets what is owed. And if the contracting institution is weak, they may deviate from the contract. And knowing that everybody's going to deviate, no one would write the contract and the market would unravel. This is the huge part of institution and economics and market. And so I think it's, weak in contract institutions are very costly. But again, going back to Daron and the paper, what is kind of interesting for me was to understand that the citizens can change the term of the contract to protect themselves, right? So that's, I think, and so it's not that they are not important, but they are really adaptable at the individual level, which makes it really not, it seems as if it's not that important, but it's really important. I think that's what I want to point. And Juni's paper is about individual contracting, like villages in village setting, right? So let's of course, we know in the context of Nepal, contracting institutions are relatively weak, relatively underlined. I don't know, I don't have an idea of how weak or strong Nepali institution is vis-a-vis other places, but and this is especially true for common pool resources like fishing, lumber, irrigation, and Juni mentioned forest, and seems like if the institutions are really weak, then the common pool resources, it seems kind of doomed. I think that was the old thought about common pool resources until Eleanor, I think, right? Juni, you can correct me if this is wrong. But so Eleanor basically came to Nepal, did a lot of work, field work, figure out what works, what doesn't work. And in her book, she basically made a list of all the stuff that makes common pool resources work, right? And she showed that it does not require central government control. I think that was the key breakaway from the old economic thought that at the individual level, people would adapt their and this is what I find to be kind of, this complements what Daron et al. Were saying. And I think that's, and so, and the question that all of us, and it's a $1 million question, I guess, there are a lot of attributes of well-functioning common pool resources, how it works, what does it work. One of the things that stands out, and I think this complements what Juni is saying, is the accountable, so the monitoring system should be accountable to each other, right? I mean, it could be either in the form of direct punishment of payments, or it could be in terms of reputation. And I think Juni's point is that reputation seems to be an important driver of the relationship between these women in our 19 villages. And why do we care about all of this stuff? If you think about it, at least from my point of view, I want to really answer this following question. Can we, as researchers, when we study these institutions, can we externally enhance some of these features where they're weak, right? So can we impose certain rules? Can we incentivize so that things become better? And I think that's the question that we all are trying to answer, and Juni is also trying to answer. Although this is a big question, it's okay. And so just to motivate a little bit of what he did and to complement again, I keep saying the word complement, to understand what works, what doesn't work, we really need to understand the endogenous institution formation. It can no longer be that we can take the institution as given. We need to kind of think about this from ground up. And network formation is a precursor to, I think, endogenous institution formation. Okay. But we also know from the econometrics of identification in network that observational network data is really, really bad to understand what are the driver of these. So what Juni did was use field experiments to try to shed light on some of this issue, which is really good, right? So there are 4 findings. Just want to recap. Dense groups, they prefer no monitor to monitor. Beautiful. Sparse group, they prefer central monitor to having either no monitor or local monitor, which makes sense. Dense groups sustain high cooperation without outside help. And this is going back to Eleanor and to Daron et al. People tend to find ways to make things work. And I think this is really central, especially in a developing country like Nepal. And what I found also kind of interesting, so outside monitoring decrease the cooperation among dense groups, right? That's what Juni was trying to say, that if we are dense, if we know each other, then having an outside monitor raise suspicion, sort of. I guess that's what I thought about. And so it kind of made people contribute less to the common pool, whereas for the sparse group, outsider increase. It's not clear exactly what is the policy implication of this to go forward, but I'm gonna let Juni talk about this in a minute. I have some few questions, just to kind of clarifying question for you to think or not think. So one is, are these results that you have in any way particular to Nepal? Like, was there anything that you learned when you were doing these field experiments that you thought that, okay, if I was doing this, let's say in Mozambique, of course, maybe you've never been there, I have never been there, this probably would not work, right? I'm mostly concerned or just thinking about low level of education among these participants. So I don't understand how to think about the inferring signaling model that you have. I didn't see differences across villages. It would have been nice to see, if this, you mentioned about caste, all of these villages where it's kind of similar. I don't know whether that's important or not. That's one question. The other thing that I was not 100% sure was, what is exactly the role of reputation here? You mentioned role of reputation kind of as a black box, but it would be nice to know exactly what is reputation here. In fact, if you could quantify, I don't know how to do it, but I can ask, right? To quantify reputation, I didn't fully understand the idea of reputation here, right? Did you see that if somebody was, if you could look at different follow-up and see what was the reputation here? And so I guess question 3 is, are the contractual institutions as adaptive as in, Asimoglu and Robinson, in a sense that, did you feel that people were really willing to work together and kind of some other information would be helpful? Of course, he's looking, they're looking at the colonies, European colonies, and exploiting differences between the British and the French system, but it's not going to work for you, but something like that would be nice. And again, I'm going to end with the last big question. Can we build, like, how can we, if you were to design contractual institution, what are the key drivers, at least in the context of Nepal, I guess, how can we build a good performing contractual institution? And if you cannot build, it seems like there's some major impediment. Can you tell us why not? All right. And I end there. And I'll stop sharing screen and I'll take questions. Juni, you can answer that now or later or never, but I just wanted to raise that point.
No, so let me answer a couple of questions and also club with the other questions that I see in the chat. So thank you so much, Gaurab, for summing up the paper so beautifully and sort of raising these interesting concerns that we've been thinking about too. So let me start off with the first bit, that is in terms of external validity. So is it particular to the case of Nepal, or can we sort of think about this outside Nepali context, which is also the question that Avi posed. So we've thought about this a lot, and our understanding is, as long as we are dealing with cases where there are limited formal institutions, where communities play a central role, where there's some sort of a social norm and reputation concern, mostly in developing country contexts, this reasoning of the fear of reputation being an effective tool for monitoring does hold. And in terms of why we did this in the field and not a lab experiment, that was one of the questions that Abi raised. So the reason we rely on a field experiment rather than a lab experiment is because we very much want to exploit real life networks, real life connections. So there's this fear of reputation, which we could sort of build in a lab setting, but which would be a little it would be external, basically, which would not be something that is already in the village, already established in the village. So we really wanted to sort of use this real network, real reputation concerns, real social ties in order to understand if reputation can be a threat or it can be a tool for enforcing cooperation. And so moving on to the next question posed by Ram, which is what econ policies can be improved? Are you able to separate confounding factors? So I think for this, I go back to the slides of Gaurab, where he very interestingly pointed out this whole contractual, there's this contract theory, the literature where in the absence of a formal institution, how do informal institutions survive, and so on and so forth. So in terms of our experiment and our paper, I think this is specific to small contracts. So we're not talking about large scale infrastructure contract, for instance. I think that could be handled differently. So we're really talking about common pool resources like irrigation, like forest, like small funds to improve situations in the village. So under such settings, where what we're trying to basically suggest, or what we're trying to sell, is under such small scale project settings, groups can enhance cooperation, not by having an external person from the government, let's say, monitoring their behavior, but by assigning monitors or letting people choose their own monitoring systems from within the villages, because there is the strong enough fear of social norms, fear of reputation concern, a fear of ostracization, that people behave in a certain manner in these contexts. So that's sort of the policy relevant, the message that we're trying to give out there. And then to come back to Gaurab's point on role of reputation, can we quantify the role of reputation? So, I mean, we could sort of ask questions in the line of reputation, but in some sense it is it's not visible to the eyes. Like it's sort of it's seen in behaviors. But in order to quantify it, we could sort of do a follow-up survey to try to see how reputation is important. So our understanding of this developing country setting, or in villages, for instance, is social norms are important. It's important to respect certain norms, to behave in a certain manner, which might not hold in a big city like Kathmandu, for instance. So in these cases, the reputation story sort of breaks down. So when I'm talking about small community villages, around 70 to 80 communities living together over years and years, I think this reputation story becomes stronger. And to quantify it, we'll need to think more about in that direction. And about informal institutions and how we can improve contracting in these settings. I think that's really an interesting question that we as researchers need to answer at large. And I think this paper is sort of a first step towards it in suggesting that, look, reputation concern in a case where social norms are important can be a plausible mechanism. But there's a lot of research being done in anthropology, sociology, also economics, political science, and how these credible institutions can be established. But my understanding is in these villages, in order to establish these credible, let's call it informal institutions, because it's not mainly through the government, but mostly relies on social ties and the fact that people care about what other people think about them, and so on and so forth. And then we had one more question by Rashesh. Were there a lot of ties in the game? So we had 3 monitoring options. No monitor, high central, low monitor, and 3 people voting. So of course there was possibility for ties, but surprisingly we find that only 2% of the cases there were ties. So mostly there was a clear winner. Either it was a high central monitor or no monitor, and the low central monitor option was not very chosen often, as we sort of had a feeling, because low monitor person is not able to communicate as effectively as somebody who's central to the village.
There's one question. Yeah, there's one hand raised. Vinish. Vinish, can you unmute? Maybe even switch on the video. Hi. Just so that we.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can
Hello?
hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So yeah, this is more of a mechanical question than broader question, really. So basically, I understand you're comparing within the sparse villages and within the dense villages to much of the extent, but broadly, like I guess when you are looking at a bigger picture, right? So I don't think the comparison across the sparse and dense can be avoided, right? So there is like within comparison, and there is the across comparison where you basically when you look at contribution. So my point is these villages, sparse versus dense, they would be different in composition, I believe, right? So they would be systematically different, other than their perception towards common pool and altruistic behaviors and things like that. Right?
So let me quickly maybe just clarify what I mean by sparse and dense villages. So these are not villages per se; these are groups. So in each village, we have groups that are sparse, groups that are dense, as a function of the social network. And so for each of these 19 villages, we randomly, because there are many ways you can be sparse from somebody. So we randomly form a sparse group versus a dense group in the village. So I mean, clarifying that, would you like to finish your question and then I can come up?
No, I think so. So basically, so yeah, I guess this is more of a clarification question, right? So if you're randomly selecting groups in, say like a sparse group, would that come from a village that is relatively sparse than the dense one?
No.
Or
so
no, is it just based off of networks in your sample?
It's just based off of networks. So for a village
I
X,
see.
So for each village, so for village, let's say Chitlang 1. So for Chitlang 1, we have the network map that I showed you, like with the connections. So for each of the network map, I can create dense and sparse groups within the villages.
So that's basically conditional upon the sample, right?
Correct.
The network in your sample. Yeah.
Correct. So it's on as a function of the network or of the. So we sample everybody in the village, so all women in the village, so that we didn't have any missing links, because then of course then dense and sparse wouldn't have so much meaning. So hence we sort of sampled the whole village, and then formed within the same village. So Chitlang 1, you have groups of people who are friends and groups of people who are far away from the network.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think so. There is the second question I had was basically about the rounds. So if you had 4 rounds of game, right? In this case,
correct.
And so here's what I'm thinking, right? So I understand you've sort of minimized the possibility of learning, but within a village, and especially in Nepal, right? So where it's a tightly knitted community, so people would talk amongst one another, right? And quite a number of studies that have sort of demonstrated that contribution in a pool decreases with the number of rounds, right? So as you keep sort of expanding the game, people will perhaps learn more, or people will perhaps spot the free riders more, and that would change their strategy in later rounds, right? So do you think, so how would your results differ if you were to just do, say, a round specific analysis, right? So I assume like everything is sort of grouped into, all four rounds are grouped together, right? In this case.
So we basically group endogenous, exogenous, dense, and sparse. Yeah, correct.
Right. So if you were to do like round, basis, would you have the same sort of results? So I guess this question is really stemming from, because if you have like a group that is dense versus group that is sparse, right? So the conversation intensity will be systematically different across these two groups, right?
Correct.
Because in sparse group, you can't really talk much.
So we're basically relying on, so imagine as dense and sparse of outside the lab setting, so in real life setting. So I'm friends with Gaurab, let's say, so we're in a group, we talk, so we're dense friends, and I'm, let's say, sparse with Vinish. So just to give you an example, so in the process of the experiment, so you mentioned being able to talk more often to dense groups than sparse groups, so there was no conversation across groups in the experiment. So the experiment happened all in one go, basically. So there was no information, there was no information that could be discussed, so to say. So they were in dense groups.
Like in about, everything was finished in about an hour.
Correct, within 1.5 2 hours. Correct, yes.
Gotcha.
So therefore there was, I mean, if we had allowed this to sort of spread and see the spillovers, I think there would be sort of a different question, which would also be interesting to sort of see, can people learn quickly if I spread information in closed groups versus sparse groups? But that would be completely different.
So I guess, like, sorry, so here's the last question of mine, right? So, but in reality, like, that's not the case, right? So in reality, people do converse, right? So it's a little bit different setup that we have, right? Cool, thank you so much.
So just to touch upon the last point, so we do converse in reality, true. And so basically it's a, you can think of it as a repeated game. So we could also have modeled like this instead of altruism parameter, we could have used sort of repeated game setting in order to understand contribution in dense and sparse, where the intensity in dense is higher compared to the sparse in terms of the number of repetitions. And I think in terms of voting, I think this is an interesting point, because in our setting, we don't allow people to talk to each other before voting for a monitor. It's done secretly in a secret ballot, and we don't reveal the information of who was chosen as a monitor. Sorry, who chose whom as a monitor, but just the final outcome is revealed. But we could think of an alternative setting where you allow these people to talk, allow these people to come up with a common solution, which is then that could be a different question altogether. So to sort of see, allowing communication in voting, does it make a difference? So that would be an interesting question to look at. Yeah.
You have one more question from Rashesh, if you want to, in the chat.
Do you observe any difference in behavior between cases where voting for monitor was unanimous by majority, so that participant differed in whether to get a monitor or not? So you mean, do we look at cases where we have everybody voting for the same choice, so no monitor, no monitor, no monitor, versus two people voting for differently and one person voting for that particular option? So we did try to look at variation along these lines, but we didn't have enough variation that we could exploit this question. But it would be, I mean, with a larger sample, with a different set, I think it would be interesting to also look at this voting difference and how it affects behavior. Yeah.
I think that's it. You've answered all the questions.
Do we
Okay,
have
so-
more questions?
Yeah, I don't see anything on the chat.
So we're good.
We could, yeah. What should we do next?
Okay, well, yeah. No harm in ending early. Thanks very much to Juni and Gaurab for presenting and moderating today. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye.